Welcome to YO Today. I'm Paul Pepis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Joseph Lowndes, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Oregon. Lowndes' interests include conservatism, the Tea Party, social movements, the GOP, race, and elections. He studies how political movements like the Tea Party come to be and the role of race and gender in politics. A regular commentator in journals like The Guardian, The Washington Post, and Newsweek, Lowndes is also the author of From the New Deal to the New Right, Race and the Southern Origins of Modern Conservatism, and co-editor of Race and American Political Development. Thanks, Joe, for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
So what led to your interest in conservative political movements? How did you wind up studying that phenomenon?
You know, I grew up in the South in a fairly conservative household, and I think, although I've always been, since my teen years, kind of politically on the left, I think when I was in graduate school, when I was reading accounts of the rise of modern conservatism or the right, the accounts seemed a little wooden or one-dimensional, and I thought that there was really much more to the story that had to be told or understood about why and how people were attracted to conservative ideas, how a mass movement was built, how the Republican Party in kind of a renovated form came to dominate politics. I came of age in kind of the Reagan era. So part of it for me was figuring out how all this happened, and part of it's probably an Oedipal struggle with my father. So.
Yes, well, all things are ultimately an Oedipal struggle with your father. So can you give us that thumbnail story of how did the new right arise? What were these other forces that you became convinced were crucial in accounting for the rise of the new right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think a lot of this has become fairly conventional today, but part of it is to understand that conservatives weren't just, they weren't just chubby-fingered capitalists with, holding the levers of industry and finance and kind of ruling over a mass of people with false consciousness. That there were compelling ideas for a lot of people that drove them into this. And I think also there's a larger picture of political and social and cultural changes happening, in particular in the 1960s, that the right was able to make a lot of hay out of. So, the Black Power movement, second wave feminism, lesbian gay rights movement, the anti-war movement, associated struggles in the 1960s which were challenging the basis of politics, the family, political culture more broadly, opened up territory for Republicans to step in and say, we're actually not just the party of the rich, we're actually the party that's going to defend your interests as people who want to hold on to the traditional family, defend your interests as white people, defend your interests as people who are uncomfortable with a series of changes coming down the pike. Now, I think partly the problem is that a number of commentators after that time saw this just as a backlash, and this is the language that was used to describe the rise of the right, I think after the 1970s, was that this was a backlash against all these radical changes that were coming down the pike. Mm-hmm. And I think it's more accurate to say that there was no natural backlash, but there was a set of circumstances on the ground that savvy political actors were able to use to pull together a new political coalition of kind of a populist right. Mm-hmm. So it was no longer, as the old kind of Democratic Party of the New Deal was starting to fray a little bit at the edges, particularly because of the struggles I just mentioned. Mm-hmm. Conservative activists and thinkers were able to come in and say, well, actually, we can represent your interests in this other way, mm-hmm. and out of that build a movement.
So this populist right movement that you're talking about in the 60s, mm-hmm. tell us how that sort of relates to the populist right movement that we're experiencing now.
It in some ways, it's almost as if we've come full circle in a certain sense. The part of what happened in the 1960s on the right was there was a language of middle America that starts to be introduced.
The silent majority.
Or the silent majority is another term. Forgotten Americans is another one. And the idea is that you've got these kind of hardworking people who pay their taxes, who don't cause trouble, who you don't see represented on college campuses or in Hollywood or among academics or bureaucrats, these people are particularly beleaguered, and they need a voice. They need someone who's going to represent them because they are the ones kind of taking it on the chin every day. And so this was, first in the language of Alabama Governor George Wallace when he ran for president in '64 and then again in '68, and then soon after Richard Nixon, who picks up on a lot of Wallace's rhetoric. It's to say that, you know, we represent people who are not the elites at the top and not the dependent poor at the bottom, these people in the middle. And so that was kind of the founding moment for the modern right that was quite populist. When I say populist, I mean an idea that it's a majoritarian politics. It's supposed to represent most of the people against a tiny group of elites who are seen to stand in the way of their self-fulfillment. So in a sense, this was kind of the origin moment of the new right. I think partly what happened is that the Republican Party, traveling along through the 70s and 80s, began to abandon white working and middle class people who they claimed to defend in the 60s and 70s. And as a result, left a lot of people feeling like, well, who's actually really defending our interests? Who is really, you've got people who are experiencing declining or stagnant wages over decades. Now, of course, we have to remember that almost in any index you could use, white people are doing better than black people and brown people, but relatively, they're doing worse and worse and feeling less and less represented. So the Republican Party, as it moves more in a financialized direction, in an anti-union direction, in an anti-worker direction, leaves open the possibility of a reassertion of this idea of middle America again. Now the party in 2012, after Romney lost, decided that they were going to begin to go after the Latino vote, the gay vote, the women's vote. And that was going to be the trajectory of the party. That was going to be this was the kind of common agreement.
Right, they had a post-mortem after that election.
Yeah, they called it the autopsy.
Right.
But what happened is at the base, it went exactly in the other direction. This reassertion of middle America again, and this time with a much more kind of hard right, white racist affect and specific political vision than had been in the party since the late 80s, I think.
So say a little bit about the sort of tensions that this, you've just described a kind of split in Republicanism. Say a little bit more about that particular tension between the kind of financial sector Republicans, low tax Republicans, and this middle America, this populist. I mean, obviously, the phenomenon of Trump sort of goes right into this division. Say a little bit about the tensions and how Trump benefited from them.
Okay. Well, in some ways, this tension has been there all along. You see it in debates between William F. Buckley and George Wallace in the late 60s, and then National Review magazine and Kevin Phillips, who had been Nixon's electoral strategist. And the beginnings of a move to old line conservatism kind of travels along one trajectory, and then right-wing populism kind of moves along another. Ronald Reagan was able to keep these things together, having really masterfully pulling together both elements. And this is where we get this term Reagan Democrats, who are union members, workers who see themselves in Reagan's coalition. But Reagan really begins an era of deregulation and of union busting that will begin to leave some of these folks behind. So you have, and then Reagan also brings into his administration a number of people who are referred to at the time as neoconservatives. Many of these people are former liberals who are economically conservative, but they are for broader open trade agreements, for open immigration policy, for greater forms of foreign intervention. And this kind of breaks with some elements of the old right. And so, there's a moment after George H.W. Bush is president. He follows Ronald Reagan. Pat Buchanan challenges him in the Republican primaries in 1992. And he's really representing what now they come to call paleo-conservatives, which are kind of the forebear of Trumpists today. Around harsh, kind of racist anti-immigrant rhetoric, anti-black rhetoric, anti-welfare rhetoric. At that point, there was a kind of a very robust cultural and religious element to it. This was the beginning of what they called the culture wars, and this was Pat Buchanan's famous speech at the 1988 Republican convention, keynote speech. But then those politics kind of they kind of disappear after that. George W. Bush wins in 2000. He is able to pull together the populists and the kind of neoconservatives for a while, but there's exhaustion with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. There is a kind of a ticking clock on the white majority, moving from majority to plurality. And there's also still intensified financialization of the economy and a yawning gap between the very rich and everyone else that we haven't seen since the Gilded Age. And so these things kind of come together in a way that open up the possibility of kind of a renewed, let's call it Buchananism, to come to the fore. And you've got people around Trump in this campaign who are saying, look, we have to defend, the Republican Party is talking about Latinos, they're talking about all these other groups wanting special rights. What happened to white people? What happened to white middle and working class people? Who is going to represent our interests? And it's not as if there's a clear split between racial and gender interests on the one hand and economic interests on the other. But part of what the Trump campaign does is frame economic issues as racial issues and frame them as gender issues. So the decline in manufacturing has to do with kind of a loss of masculinity, a loss of racial status in the workplace. And so this is how these things are pulled together in a way that really opens the door for a very sharpened right-wing politics that then brings in all these new voters into the Republican primaries. And so here comes Trump, and he beats out 16 very capable challengers with this kind of insurgent base, which then begins to transform the party. And as it transforms the party, there's nothing that the conservative standard bearers can really do about it, because it's, what Paul Ryan, every time there's some outrage, racial or gender or some other kind of outrage that Trump is responsible for, Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan will come out and say, oh, this is terrible. It doesn't represent the best interest of the party. And then 2 days later, they're back on board. And partly there's nothing really they can do about it. This is where the party is now. This is where the voters are in that party. And, this is that demographic of these older white voters is shrinking all the time. So it's in their interest, too, to begin doubling down on voter suppression and other things that will that mesh with the Trump agenda. So there's ways in which the split in the Republican Party is held at bay, partly because of a shared electoral strategy, and partly because mainline conservatives really can do very little to go against what the base is calling for at this point.
Okay, so you just mentioned the Trump agenda. And everything you described is what Trump said he would do on the campaign trail. So 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, the tax bill passes. Yesterday, Trump's administration releases their budget. So I'm not talking about the agenda, I'm talking about policy. Policy, that tax bill is no different from the tax bills that George Bush would pass. And Trump says on the campaign trail, I'm the only one who is not going to touch Social Security. I'm the only one who's not going to touch Medicaid and Medicare of the Republicans. Paul Ryan has been wanting to dismantle the welfare state for his entire career. The budget that comes out yesterday significantly cuts those programs. So what is Trumpism now, if in terms of policy, in terms of economic policy, let's say, it isn't all that different from mainline conservative economic policy. Is that contradiction, is the gap there going to signify for these older white working class voters who are the base for Trump support?
Well, I would say that the Trump base actually it's working class, middle class, and upper middle class. I think it's partly race that has pulled these folks together. So it's not as if it's a clear economic line, although there are elements of that there. Any presidential coalition is going to be an assemblage of different elements. I think what Trump shares with conservative Republicans in terms of the tax law is kind of a sense of aggressive asset stripping, let's call it. And I think it is true that this goes against what he promised the base in many ways. But I think there's a couple things. One, in presidential politics, you have to partly look at what latitude the president has to do certain things on his own through executive agencies.
Oh yeah, sure.
And the other one is what he has to do with Congress. And so partly you have Trump unable to get a lot of things done, get almost anything done with Congress, in his first year. So partly they have to figure out well, how are we going to pull this together?
Oh yeah.
And I think there are economic conservatives around Trump now, and I think particularly since the departure of people like Steve Bannon, who kept calling himself an economic nationalist in a way that would go against some of these things. He's much more amenable to these kind of these kind of economic conservative policies. On the other hand, he also has this this massive infrastructure element to it, which itself is not populist in an old kind of left way. It's a lot of it's private partnerships and these kinds of things, which are going to put other things first before general public needs. But you'll see Republicans balking at that right now. So in terms of that kind of thing, I think that there is going to be a continual jockeying with economic conservatives in Congress. The places where you see kind of a hard, kind of white racial agenda happening is partly through the Attorney General's office, partly through Homeland Security, partly through other things that they can really try to achieve. And partly those two work together. If he can deliver the red meat of build the wall, oppose immigration, articulate a politics which is about rounding up undocumented people. This is kind of the these are the sacrificial lambs that he can throw out that allows this other work to get done.
And will keep the old conservative guard on board with him. They'll get the things that are important for their policies, the tax cuts,
yes,
et cetera.
in terms of passing bills specifically, yes. I mean, and they are loath to really to push against him and be very critical because they're stuck. And so I think that we are now seeing a trajectory of the party overall in an increasingly hard right direction, and it won't just be Trump. I mean, Trump, who himself is probably kind of an empty vessel, but people who share those political the political values we associate with Trumpism are going to increasingly drive partisan commitments. And you might see, this become sharpened and kind of economic populists, come up against the neoliberals again and future election cycles. Kind of the way you've seen it in the Democratic Party as well.
So let's talk a little bit about the Democratic Party. So we talked about right-wing populism. I think it's fair to say that part of the Bernie Sanders phenomenon, which was also quite a phenomenon, I mean, the political establishment was very dismissive of him. Yeah. There is a kind of left-wing populist component to that phenomenon. So what's your sense of the role of left-wing populism in American politics? Do you think that that's also a force that's going to become increasingly important? There is obviously the question of will the Democratic Party establishment come to terms with that movement? But is that a significant political movement in the next 10 years or 15 years in your view?
I think it depends on a lot of factors. But part of the issue with left-wing populism, and partly the question we have to ask is why did populist politics capture the imagination of right-wing voters as opposed to left-wing voters across this time period of the last half century, when the populist movement of the 19th century was clearly a left-wing movement. But if you dig down a little bit into populism, there are elements of it, what historians call producerism, the idea that at the center of society is the virtuous producer who's neither rich nor poor, is a small property owner, what Tocqueville called the anxious men of small property. Who can push an agenda which can either go against economic elites or state elites, but the problem with it is how you imagine who is the American majority, and if the Democrats have to, I think Sanders the Sanders movement was quite extraordinary, and no one expected it, and it was gigantic, and it has fundamentally altered the party in certain ways. But he showed himself early on to be tone deaf to questions of race, for instance, and he worked hard on that and tried to figure that out, and in a number of ways. But there was this idea of just bring back manufacturing, or speaking just in a language of industrial renewal. It's not exactly the kind of politics that's going to bring in broad numbers of people who are really disenfranchised in almost permanent ways from the system. And we have entire communities that are, have suffered state abandonment as well as capital abandonment for generations now. I think just a promise of bring back manufacturing is not a way to build a broad coalition on the left that can really overcome some of these problems. And then at the heart of it, the Democratic Party is split between really people committed to neoliberalism, when I say really committed to trade agreements, to the banking system, to things that skew towards the very top. And they have a lot of power in the party, which is, of course, the Sandersite criticism all along, which they're quite right. And they're not necessarily going anywhere. This was the Obama wing of the party. It was the Clinton wing of the party. It's kind of the ghost of the Democratic Leadership Council, which is still there. So it would require something, I think ultimately, to see a kind of left populism emerge that has any relationship with the Democratic Party, it will probably have to continually come from below and outside the party. The places that pushed open the doors that allowed Sandersism to happen, I think, were the Occupy movement, Black Lives Matter, associated social movements, and smaller insurrections around the U.S. that really that put pressure from the outside and pressed from below and made that happen. Sanders, of course, himself wasn't even a member of the Democratic Party until the campaign. So I think that part of this depends not just on partisan politics, but where else we see political action in society.
So do you have a prediction about the next presidential election?
The thing is, I'm always wrong.
Yeah.
And so I should probably predict what I hope will not happen, and then it will happen.
So let's talk a little bit about mass media and the presidency. So since Roosevelt, U.S. presidents have used the mass media to connect directly with the American people. Obama's the first president to use Twitter. Trump is the one who has mastered or commands Twitter. Say a little bit about your sense of the role of, in particular, these new media platforms in American politics now.
I think that they're linked to forms of kind of modern populism, I think, in distinct ways. When Nixon is the first president to decide to kind of go over the heads of the press and straight to the American people. His famous silent majority speech was exactly about that.
And the checker speech is another one, right?
Is another one, yes, yeah. And so, we had speechwriters like William Safire who talked about nattering nabobs of negativism and that kind of thing, and really speaking directly to the people in a way that made the press the enemy, that demonized other opponents of the presidency. And in a way, that kind of expansion of executive power, which the Anti-Federalists were anxious about at the very beginning, gets taken up with George W. Bush. Their extraordinary arrogance towards the press and kind of brutality towards the press, and kicking people out of the White House press corps who gave them negative, press and that kind of thing, made it so that we've had a slow erosion over time, which has opened up the possibility of a president who can use social media to go straight to the public in these kinds of ways, which are they're quite extraordinary, I think. And but I think this is largely what, in this changed landscape, this is what it's going to look like. We've seen kind of the erosion of the traditional press, which partly has to do with, changes in media conglomeration. Changes in how media is regulated. I mean, there's all kinds of things that have kind of destroyed mainstream institutions of media, as well as kind of money chasing from major media organizations.
Infotainment.
Yes, that have made this possible, I think. And so now, with social media and with the president who has such an exquisite sense of this. Remember, he was on The Apprentice for a decade, focus grouping after each episode, finding out exactly what worked best and what worked least well. And it's a little bit like Reagan in that way. People saw Reagan as a fool, but his ability to connect with publics was quite intuitive. And I think there's something similar with Trump. He he ends up sustaining some. These days, actually, his numbers are not so bad. I think partly he knows how to use those kinds of direct forms to achieve what he wants to achieve.
So we've had a very interesting discussion about the work that you do as a scholar and a researcher. You're also a teacher. So tell me about a class or two that you teach.
What do I teach? I teach a general intro to U.S. government and politics, which I love. It's a big class of 150 students, and we go through all the general institutions of governance in the U.S. and partly from an historical perspective. And you get a lot of first-year students in these classes, and I love that class because it's really what I really try to do is just draw them into politics and bring them into the cult of politics. And I can teach them that, or try to demonstrate to them that everything they may not, as someone said, they may not be interested in politics, but politics is interested in them. And so that's what I try to use that course to really make it palpable to them why politics actually matters in real ways in their lives, and that it can be interesting and a passion and torturous and everything else. I teach a course in U.S. racial politics, which kind of is partly historical from the kind of the mid-20th century to the present, partly institutional, partly structural, partly through social movements. I teach American political thought, where we kind of go back through, partly through the greatest hits of U.S. political thinkers, but where we see recurring themes. These days, the kind of racial nationalists of the early 20th century, like Madison Grant, are kind of seen to be back in vogue on the in U.S. politics. So there's some kind of interest and fun in realizing some of the roots of questions of gender and race and sexuality and hierarchy and questions of democracy and freedom, which come up in there, which is a lot of fun.
So we've got a minute left. Last question. What are you working on now?
One of the things I'm working on is kind of a history of right-wing populism, which we've kind of been talking about. I'm also doing a short co-authored book on the alt-right in the streets over the last year. And so I've been hitting different venues.
Well, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you, Joe, for taking the time to speak with us, and good luck with that research.
Thanks for having me, Paul.
I've been speaking with Joseph Lowndes, Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Oregon. Thanks so much for watching.